If you had one wish, what would it be? Wealth, fame, love? Well, what I would wish for is the power to convince anyone. And let me tell you why. But first, back when I was 7 years old, the PlayStation 4 console had just hit the stores. And all of my friends owned one. So naturally, I tried to persuade my parents into buying me one. But sadly, with all my efforts, they declined. Well, of course, how can a mere child persuade anyone? If only a 7-year-old me had the persuasion skills to convince them. And so, recently, after reflecting upon this moment, I wondered, how can I improve my persuasion skills to get anything I want? And this question led me to discover an incredible book by Robert Cialdini called Influence, the Psychology of Persuasion. I read the book and found numerous useful methods of persuasion. And intrigued by the idea that the internet could hold even more useful methods, I conducted further research online. And from my research, I found 3 methods of persuasion that prove the most useful. I use these methods and can wholeheartedly tell you that they changed my life and they can certainly change yours. First of which, in 1966, Jonathan Friedman of Stanford University and Scott Fraser of the Southern University of California conducted an experiment where they would approach house owners and asked to place a huge sign saying, "Drive carefully," in their front yards. Initially, less than 20% of people accepted. The researchers then approached a second group of houses and asked to place a small "Drive carefully" sign, and a lot of people agreed. The researchers, though, came back to the houses with the small signs and asked to replace it with the same huge sign. But this time around, 76% of people accepted. And you might be wondering, what's the reasoning behind this? This is because people tend to approach it with a mentality of, since I accepted the smaller request, why not consider adding a bit more and embrace the larger one? And this is what psychologists call the foot in the door technique, whereby agreeing to a small request makes it far more likely for people to agree to a larger one. Now, considering that the foot in the door technique is widely discussed in psychological terms, its applications go beyond personal interactions. As a matter of fact, one of the areas where the foot in the door technique could be most utilized is within the education system. Students often face difficulties effectively communicating with their teachers. But by using the foot in the door technique, students could potentially make this communication process much easier. And here's how. Let's assume that you've received a commendable A- on an assignment, but you aspire for that A+. Are you unsure of what to do? Here's a strategy to help you out. Start off by approaching your teacher and politely asking for a small bonus assignment that would bump up your grade from an A- to an A. More often than not, they're gonna agree since it's a small task for a small reward, right? If they do agree, seize the opportunity and ask for just another small bonus assignment that would round up your grade to an A+. And I guarantee you, from past personal experience, that they're gonna accept. And just like that, your grade just jumped from an A- to an A+, just by using the foot in the door technique. This shows how a seemingly small request could hold a massive outcome. Now, the next technique that I'll be talking about has less to do with feet and doors and more to do with doors and faces. And it's called the door in the face technique. And instead of starting small, this one begins off with an outrageously large request and then moving on to a smaller and more reasonable offer. A study conducted by Alexander Pascal of the University of Bordeaux and Nicolas Guggen of the Southern University of Brittany took place in a restaurant. And it involved a woman who had pretended that she had lost her purse and couldn't pay for the bill. So she asked other customers to pay for her bill. And initially, only about 10% of people helped her out. Other times, she would ask customers to pay for her entire bill. And when they said no, she then would ask for the small contribution. And this time around, 75% of people helped her out. And a common question is, what causes such a leap from 10% to 75% acceptance? This is because by rejecting an initial request, it implants a sense of guilt in a person. And this sense of guilt is what causes someone to perceive the following request as more reasonable. Now hold on just a second. Earlier, I mentioned how students could use the art of persuasion to their benefit. It would be unfair if I didn't help my dear teachers out, right? So, to our dedicated teachers, it's no secret that whenever sending out sizable assignments, it's often followed by a flood of complaints from the students. But, they say, for every problem, there's a solution. And here's a solution to help you out. Let's assume you intend to assign a 5-page task and expecting the inevitable complaints to come along with it. For a change, try assigning an initial 8-page assignment. And when the complaints just start rolling in, swiftly transition back to the 5-page assignment that you originally intended. You will be surprised to find that this time around, students are far less likely to complain. And this is because the initial 8-page assignment set an example that made the 5-page one seem not just more reasonable, but entirely acceptable. And to further show you just how powerful these persuasion methods are, allow me to share a personal anecdote from my life that just might persuade you. Whenever going out with friends, I usually ask my parents for some pocket money. And one day I decided to test out with the door in the face technique. So, instead of asking for the usual $20 that I receive, I started with a bold ask of $40. And when my parents said no, I then followed up with a $30 request. And sure enough, they agreed. Now, you must be thinking, a jump from $20 to $30 is not that much, but consider this. It's a 50% increase from my usual allowance. So, by initially presenting an exaggerated request, it makes the following one seem more reasonable and therefore acceptable. And now, before we dive into our third and final method of persuasion, I would like all of you to raise your hand up and clench a fist, just like so, and hold it for a few seconds. All right, you could put your hands back down now. Depending on where you placed your thumb, if you placed your thumb outside of your fingers, just like picture A, then you're actually a unique person with a creative mindset who's more extroverted and with a unique personality. But I bet what you didn't know is that if you place your thumb inside of your fingers, just like picture B, then you're a more introverted person who would rather be alone than with others. And I also bet what you didn't know is that everything I just said was completely made up, with no scientific evidence backing it up. And I'm sure many of you believed me. And this is where our third and final method of persuasion comes into play, called the principle of authority. And basically, it's the idea that people will follow to and listen to the ideas and advice of credible and knowledgeable figures. One example of this is that doctors are able to persuade more of their patients to comply with their exercise programs if they display their medical diplomas on the walls of their consulting rooms. Another example is that people are more likely to be persuaded and to take advice from, let's say, a TEDx speaker than your normal everyday person. A study conducted in 1951 by Carl Hovland of Yale University and Walter Wise, titled The Influence of Source Credibility on Communication Effectiveness, showed that people are more likely to be persuaded by messages delivered by people who are perceived as experts. Not only that, but they also exhibited a greater change in attitude. In contrast, when the message was delivered by a person who was not perceived as an expert, it did not carry the same level of effect. And there's even a real-world example that portrays these results quite well. In April of 1955, Dr. Jonas Salk, a virologist in the University of Pittsburgh, introduced his inactivated polio vaccine as safe, efficient, and potent. Salk then took to radio and television, where he calmly and expertly explained the science behind his vaccine, which would later on help over 2 million American families enroll their children in the subsequent field trial, the largest medical test in history. And within a matter of 2 years, the number of polio cases in the US dropped from 58,000 to 5,600, a nearly 90% drop. This is a mass demonstration of how Dr. Jonas Salk's authority and credibility as a scientist helped turn public skepticism into widespread trust. And so, before trying to persuade anyone to follow your advice or opinion, try to present yourself as a credible, knowledgeable figure. After all, mastering these methods shows us just how powerful our ability to influence others can be in every aspect of our lives. Whether it's convincing our parents to buy us a PlayStation or persuading our teachers to change our grades. One thing remains clear, that the art of persuasion is a skill worth mastering. Now, I have a challenge for you. For the next time that you'd like to persuade someone, whether it's convincing your teacher to give you additional marks, proposing an idea at work, or even negotiating bedtime with your parents. For a change, pick a persuasion method, plan an approach, test it out, adjust, and finally grow. Now, before I end my speech, I would really hate to leave you on a cliffhanger. Back at the start of my speech, I threw this notebook on the ground, and you're probably wondering, what's inside? Is it my prepared speech in case I forgot? Or perhaps my personal diary that I would not like to share with any of you? Well, sorry to break the news to you, but it's none of those, but it is an empty notebook. And would you believe me if I said that this empty notebook serves more value to me than if it has my speech on it? And this is because of two reasons. First of which, it's an obvious attention grabber, which, to be honest, worked quite well. Secondly, is because it ties back to our third principle method of persuasion, which we just talked about, the principle of authority. Anyone who had assumed that my speech were to be written on this notebook came to find out that I don't need it, which implicitly put the idea that I'm an expert who knows what they're doing in their head. So, if an empty notebook could do all this, imagine the possibilities that open up once you harness the power of persuasion, both ethically and effectively. And this empty notebook will serve as a reminder that you may start with an empty page, but with the right approach, you can write your own outcomes. Thank you.